Good afternoon, War and Peace, quarantine reading, story time, friends. This is the final reading of War and Peace. We have made it to the end, and as you can see from my thumbnail, I am dropping this book. That is the end. We are going to read the very end of the epilogue, and there is, in the appendix, it's mostly notes about historical things, but there's a letter from Tolstoy, so we will end with that letter, which he kind of, I think, talks a little bit about his process and what it meant for him writing the book, and maybe some historical context. So that will be the very end. I warn you, it is a longer reading today, probably like yesterday, maybe a little less, but also two, it seems like it's going to be really meaty, sort of dense, philosophical stuff. So if you're here for the story, I believe that this is the end. I don't believe there is no more description about the characters and their interaction. We kind of saw the end sort of their life, and what their state of affairs is. So if you are here for the characters, I think we are done with them. You can switch off, I'm sorry. But if you want the satisfaction of finishing this book, philosophical ramblings and all, stay tuned. It's happening now. I appreciate you all being here. Always check out the War and Peace playlist if you just miss it. Tomorrow there's no reading because we'll be done today. And I'm going to be taking a week, maybe two off. In the meantime, feel free to send me recommendations of books you'd like to read. And if I haven't read them and I can get my hands on them, and I won't be violating any copyright rules to do it, we'll read them. And what else? I think that's all the news. But I will be posting on my channel maybe once or twice while there is no reading, just to kind of keep you guys posted of when the readings will start again and what we'll be reading. So if you want to get a copy and read along, you can. But let's not dwell too much on that, and let's just focus on the task at hand, which is finishing this very, very well-written, meaty, dense piece of classic literature. So hopefully the microphone volume is okay today. I have a feeling it's a little bit soft, eh? Let me just see. Situating this mic so that I don't feel like I'm going to drop it is always the tricky part, so that I can connect with you without having a mic right in my face. All right, so we're in the epilogue. We're in part 2 of the epilogue, and we will be reading starting with section 8. If history had to do with no more than external phenomena, the positing of this simple and obvious law would be enough, and we would be done with our argument. But the law of history relates to man. A particle of matter cannot tell us that it feels no need at all to attract or repel, and it is not true. But man, who is the subject of history, says outright, "I am free and therefore not subject to the law." The presence of the question of man's free will, though unspoken, is felt at every step of history. All serious-minded historians have involuntarily arrived at this question. All the contradictions and obscurities of history, the wrong path that this science has taken, are based only on the non-solution of this question. If the will of each man were free, that is, if each could act as he pleased, the whole history would be a series of incoherent accidents. If even one man out of 1,000,000 in a 1,000-year period of time has had the possibility of acting freely, that is, as he pleased, then it is obvious that one free act of this man, contrary to the laws, destroys the possibility of the existence of any laws whatever for the whole of mankind. If there is just one law that governs the actions of men, then there can be no free will, for the will of man would have to submit to that law. In this contradiction lies the question of freedom of the will, which from ancient times has occupied the best minds of mankind, and since ancient times has been posed in all its enormous significance. The question consists in the fact that in looking at a man as an object of observation from any point of view, theological, historical, ethical, philosophical, we find a general law of necessity to which he is subject, like all that exists. While looking at him from within ourselves, as that which we are conscious of, we feel ourselves free. This consciousness is a totally separate source of self-knowledge, independent of reason. Though reason, man observes himself, but he knows himself only through consciousness. Without consciousness of oneself, no observation and no application of reason are thinkable. In order to understand, observe, deduce, man must first be conscious of himself as alive. A living man knows himself not otherwise than as wanting, that is, he is conscious of his will. And his will, which constitutes the essence of his life, man is conscious of, and cannot be conscious of otherwise than as free. If, subjecting himself to observation, man sees that his will is always directed according to one and the same law, whether he observes the necessity of taking food or the activity of the brain or whatever, he cannot understand this always identical direction of his will toward otherwise than as a limitation of it. That which is not free cannot be limited. Man will appear limited to himself, to him precisely because he is conscious of it and not otherwise than as free. You say, I am not free, but I have raised and lowered my arm. Everyone understands that this illogical answer is an irrefutable proof of freedom. This answer is the expression of a consciousness not subject to reason. If the consciousness of freedom were not a subject of knowledge, not a separate source of self-knowledge, independent of reason, it would be subject to reasoning and experience, but in reality such subjection never occurs and is unthinkable. A series of experiments and arguments show each man that as an object of observation he is subject to certain laws, and man submits to them and never fights against the laws of gravity or of impermeability, once he knows them. But that same series of experiments and arguments show him that full freedom, which he is conscious of in himself, is impossible, that his every action depends on his constitution, his character, and the motives that influence him. Yet man never submits to the conclusions of these experiments and arguments. Having learned from experience and argument that a stone falls downward, man believes it unquestioningly, and in all cases expects the law he has learned to be fulfilled. But having learned as unquestionably that his will is subject to laws, he does not and cannot believe it. However many times experience and arguments have shown a man that in the same conditions with the same character, he would do the same thing he did before, he, when he sets out for the 1,000th time, in the same conditions, with the same character, on an action that has always ended the same way, undoubtedly feels no less certain that he can act as he pleases than he did before the experience. Every man, savage or sage, however irrefutably argument and experience prove to him that it is impossible to imagine two acts in the same condition, feels that without this senseless notion, which constitutes the essence of freedom, he cannot imagine life. He feels that, impossible as it may be, it is so. For without this notion of freedom, he not only would not understand life, but could not live for a single moment. He could not live because of all man's strivings, all his impulses to life, are but strivings towards greater freedom. Wealth and poverty, fame and obscurity, power and submission, strength and weakness, health and sickness, education and ignorance, work and idleness, satiety and hunger, virtue and vice are nothing but greater or lesser degrees of freedom. It is impossible to imagine to oneself a man who has no freedom otherwise than as deprived of life. If, for some reason, the concept of freedom presents itself as senselessly contradictory, like the possibility of performing two acts in the same moment of time, or an action without a cause, that only proves that consciousness is not subject to reason. This consciousness of freedom, unshakable, irrefutable, not subject to experience or argument, recognized by all thinkers and sensed by all human beings, without exception, as consciousness without which any notion of man is unthinkable, constitutes the other side of the question. Man is the creation of an almighty, all-good, and all-knowing God. What then is sin, the concept of which follows from the consciousness of man's freedom? That is the question of theology. Men's actions are subject to general, immutable laws expressed by statistics. In what, then, consists man's responsibility before society, the concept of which follows from the consciousness of man's freedom? That is a question for jurisprudence. Man's acts follow from his innate character and the motives acting upon him. What is conscience, and the conscience of the good and evil of acts following from the consciousness of freedom? That is the question for ethics. A man, in connection with the common life of mankind, appears subject to the laws defining that life. But the same man, independent of that connection, appears free. How should the past life of people and of mankind be regarded? As a product of the free or unfree activity of men. That is a question for history. Only in our self-confident time of the popularization of knowledge, thanks to the most powerful tool of ignorance, the spread of printing, has the question of freedom of will been reduced to grounds on which the question itself cannot exist. In our time, the majority of so-called advanced people, that is, a crowd of ignoramuses, have taken the works of the naturalists who study one side of the question for the solution to the whole question. The soul and freedom do not exist. Because the life of man is expressed in muscular movements, and muscular movements are conditioned by nervous activity. The soul and freedom do not exist because at some unknown period of time we descended from the apes, they say, write and print, not even suspecting that thousands of years ago all religions and all thinkers not only recognized but never tried to deny that the very law of necessity which they now try so zealously to prove by means of physiology and comparative zoology. They do not see that the role of natural science in this question consists only in serving as an instrument to throw light on one side of it. For the fact that, from the point of view of observation, reason and will are only the secretions of the brain, and man, following a general law, could develop from lower animals at an unknown period of time, only clarifies, from a new side, a truth recognized thousands of years ago by all religions and philosophical theories, that from the viewpoint of reason, man is subject to the laws of necessity, but does not advance by a hair in the solution of the question, which has another, opposite side based on the consciousness of freedom. If man descended from the apes at an unknown period of time, that is as comprehensible as that man descended from a handful of earth at a known period of time. In the first case, the x is time, and the second the descent. And the question of how the consciousness of man's freedom can be combined with the law of necessity to which man is subject cannot be resolved by comparative physiology and zoology, for in the frog, the rabbit, and the ape we can observe only muscular and nervous activity, while in man both muscular and nervous activity and consciousness. The naturalists and their admirers who think to solve this question are like plasterers assigned to plaster one side of a church wall, who, taking advantage of the foreman's absence, in a fit of zeal, smear their plaster all over the windows, the icons, the scaffolding, and the as yet unreinforced walls, and rejoice at how, from their plastering point of view, everything comes out flat and smooth. Section 9. For the solution of the question of freedom and necessity, history has the advantage over other branches of knowledge in which the same question is raised, that for history this question refers not to the essence of man's will, but to the notion of the manifestation of that will in the past and under certain conditions. For the solution of this question, history stands to other sciences in the position of an experimental science to speculative sciences. History has as its subject not the will of man itself, but our notion of it, and therefore the insoluble mystery of the combining of the two opposites, freedom and necessity, does not exist for history as it does for theology, ethics, and philosophy. History examines the notions of man's life in which the combining of these two opposites has already taken place. In actual life, every historical account, every human action, is understood quite clearly and definitely, without the least sense of contradiction, even though each event appears partly free and partly necessary. To solve the question of how freedom and necessity are combined, and what constitutes the essence of these two concepts, philosophy of history can and must follow a path opposite to the one other sciences have taken. Instead of defining the concepts of freedom and necessity in themselves and then fitting the phenomena of life to the worked out definitions, history must take the immense number of phenomena lying before it, which always appear dependent on freedom and necessity, from them derive a definition of the concepts of freedom and necessity themselves. Whatever notion of the activity of many people or one man we examine, we understand is not necessary that as a product partly of freedom and partly of the law of necessity. Whether we are speaking of the migration of peoples and the raids of barbarians, or the decrees of Napoleon III, or the act of a man performed an hour ago, which consisted in choosing one direction out of many for a stroll, we see not the slightest contradiction. The measure of freedom and the necessity that guided the acts of these men is clearly defined for us. Quite often, the notion of greater or lesser freedom varies according to the different points of view from which we examine a phenomenon, but always in the same way, every human action appears to us not otherwise than as a certain conjunction of freedom and necessity. In every action examined, we see a certain portion of freedom and a certain portion of necessity. And always, the more freedom we see in whatever action, the less necessity, and the more necessity, the less freedom. The ratio of freedom to necessity decreases or increases depending on the point of view from which the action is examined, but this ratio always remains inversely The ratio of freedom to necessity decreases or increases depending on the point of view from which the action is examined. But this ratio always remains inversely proportional. A drowning man who clutches another and drowns him, or a hungry mother exhausted from nursing her baby who steals food, or a man accustomed to discipline who stands in a firing squad and kills a defenseless man on command appears less guilty, that is, less free, and more subject to the law of necessity to someone who knows the conditions these people were in, and more free to someone who does not know that the man was himself drowning, that the mother was hungry, that the soldier was in a firing squad, and so on. In the same way, a man who 20 years ago committed a murder and after that lived peacefully and harmlessly in society appears less guilty, his act more subject to the law of necessity, for someone who examines it after a lapse of 20 years, and more freedom to someone who examined it the day after it was committed. In the same way, every act of a crazy, drunk, or greatly agitated man appears less free and more necessary to someone who knows the inner state of the one who commits the act, and more free and less necessary to someone who does not know it at all. In all these cases, the concept of freedom increases or decreases, and correspondingly, the concept of necessity decreases or increases depending on the point of view from which the act is examined. So that the greater the necessity appears, the less the freedom appears, and vice versa. Religion, mankind's common sense, jurisprudence, and history itself understand this ratio between necessity and freedom in the same way. All occasions, without exception, in which our notions of freedom and necessity increase and decrease have only three bases. 1. The relation of the man committing the acts to the external world. 2. To time, and 3. To the causes of producing the act. 1. The first basis is the relation more or less visible to us of the man to the external world, the more or less clear notion that definite place which every man occupies in relation to everything that exists simultaneously with him. That is the basis owing to which it is obvious that the drowning man is less free and more subject to necessity than a man standing on dry land. That basis owing to which the actions of a man living in close connection with other people in a densely populated area, the actions of a man who is connected with family, work, enterprises, appears unquestioningly less free and more subject to the necessity than the actions of a man who is single and solitary. If we examine a man alone, without his relation to everything around him, his every action appears free to us. But if we see at least some relation to what is around him, if we see his connection with anything whatever, with the man who is talking to him, with the book he is reading, with the work he is doing, even the air that surrounds him, even the light that falls on things around him, we see that each of these conditions has an influence on him and guides at least one side of his activity. And insofar as we see these influences, so far our notion of his freedom decreases, and our notion of the necessity he is subject to increases. 2. The second basis is the more or less visible temporal relation of a man to the world, the more or less clear notion of the place that the action of a man occupies in time. That is that basis owing to which the fall of the first man, which has had its consequence, the origin of mankind, appears, obviously, less free than a modern man's marriage. That is that basis owing to which the life and activity of people who lived a century ago and are connected with me in time cannot appear as free to me as modern life, the consequences of which are still unknown to me. The degree of our notion of greater or lesser freedom and necessity in this relation depends on the greater or lesser span of time between the committing of the act and our judgment of it. If I examine an act I committed a moment ago under approximately the same conditions as I am in now, my action seems unquestionably free to me. But if I review an act I committed a month ago, I I involuntarily recognize, being in different conditions, that if that act had not been committed, many useful, agreeable, and even necessary things which resulted from that act would not have taken place. If I transport myself in memory to an act still more remote, 10 years back or more, the consequences of my act will appear still more obvious to me, and it will be hard for me to imagine what would have happened if the act had not been done. The further back I transport myself in memory, or, what is the same, ahead in my judgment, the more questionable my argument about the freedom of the act will become. In history, we find exactly the same progression of convincingness about the portion of free will in the general affairs of mankind. A just accomplished contemporary event appears to us as unquestionably proceeding from all known people, but in a more remote event we see its inevitable consequences, aside from which we cannot imagine anything else. And the further back we transport ourselves in examining events, the less arbitrary they appear to us. The Austro-Prussian War appears to us as the unquestionable consequence of the actions of cunning Bismarck, and so on. The Napoleonic Wars, though questionably now, still appear to us as proceeding from the wills of heroes. In the Crusades, we already see an event which occupies a definite place, and without which the modern history of Europe is unthinkable, though in the same way, for the chroniclers of the Crusades, this event appeared only as proceeding from the wills of several people. As for the migration of peoples, it never occurred to anyone in our time that the arrival of the European world depended on the good of Attila. As for the migration of peoples, it never occurs to anyone in our time that the renewal of the European world depended on the good pleasure of Attila. The further back in history we transport the object of our observation, the more questionable becomes the freedom of the men producing events, and the more obvious the law of necessity. Section 3. The third basis is the greater or lesser accessibility for us of that endless linking of causes that constitutes the inevitable demand of reason, and in which every phenomenon comprehended, and therefore every human action, should have its definite place, as a consequence of what precedes and a cause of what follows. This is that basis owing to which our own and other people's actions appear to us, on the one hand, as more free and less subject to necessity, the more we know of those physiological, psychological, and historical laws man is subject to, deduced from observation, and the more correctly we perceive the physiological, psychological, or historical cause of the action. And on the other hand, the simpler the observed action itself, and the less complex the character and mind of the man whose action we are examining. When we totally fail to understand the cause of an act, whether an evil deed or a good deed, or even an act indifferent to good and evil, we recognize in such an act a greater share of freedom. If it is an evil deed, we most of all demand punishment for such an act. If it is a good deed, we most of all appreciate such an act. If it is indifferent, we recognize its greater individuality, originality, and freedom. But if just one of the countless reasons is known to us, we already recognize a certain share of necessity and demand a lesser requital for the crime, recognize a lesser merit in the good deed, a lesser freedom in the seemingly original act. The fact that a criminal was brought up among evildoers already extenuates his guilt. And the selflessness of a father, of a mother, selflessness with a possibility of reward, is more comprehensible than causeless selflessness, and therefore appears less deserving of sympathy, less free. The founder of a sect or party, the inventor, surprise us less when we know how and by what his activity was prepared for. If we find a large series of experiences, if our observation is constantly directed at finding the correlation of causes and effects in people's actions, their actions appear the more necessary and the less free to us. The more correctly we connect effects with causes. If the examined actions are simple, we have for observation an enormous number of such actions, our notion of their necessity will be more complete. The dishonest act of the son of a dishonest father, the bad behavior of a woman who ended up in a certain milieu, a drunkard's return to drinking, and so on, are actions which appear the less free to us, the more comprehensible we find their cause. And if the person himself, whose actions we are examining, stands on the lowest level of mental development, like a child, a madman, a simpleton, then, knowing the cause of the action and the incomplexity of his character in mind, we already see so large a share of necessity and so small of freedom that once the cause that is to produce the action is known to us, we can predict the act. Only on these three bases have irresponsibility for crimes and extenuating circumstances, which exist in all legal codes, been constructed. Responsibility appears greater or lesser depending on a greater or lesser knowledge of the conditions in which the man whose action is being reviewed found himself, and on the greater or lesser span of time from committing of the act to the judging of it, and on the greater or lesser understanding of the causes of the act. I warned you. Section 10. Thus, our notion of freedom and necessity gradually decreases or increases depending on the greater or lesser connection with the external world, the greater or lesser distance in time, and the greater or lesser dependence on causes in which we examine the phenomenon of human life. So that, if we examine a man in such a situation that his connection with the external world is almost fully known, the period between the time of judgment and the time of committing the acts is longest, and the causes of the act are most accessible, then we get the notion of the greatest necessity and the least freedom. But if we examine a man in least dependence on external conditions, if his action is committed in the moment closest to the present, and the causes of his action are inaccessible to us, then we will get the notion of the least necessity and the greatest freedom. But neither in the one case nor in the other, however we may change our point of view, however we may try to grasp what connection the man finds himself in with the external world, or however inaccessible it may seem to us, however much we lengthen or shorten the period of time, however intelligible or unfathomable the causes are for us, we can never imagine either total freedom or total necessity. 1. However we may try to imagine a man excluded from the influence of the external world, we will never arrive at a concept of freedom in space. A man's every action is inevitably conditioned by what surrounds him and by his own body. I will raise my arm and lower it. My action seems free to me, but asking myself if I could raise my arm in any direction, I see that I raised my arm in the direction in which there were fewest obstacles to that action, either from the bodies around me or from the structure of my own body. If, out of all possible directions, I choose one, I did so because there were fewer obstacles in that direction. For my action to be free, it is necessary that it not meet with any obstacles. To imagine a man as free, we must imagine him outside of space, which is obviously impossible. 2. However close together we bring the time of judgment to the time of the act, we will never get a concept of freedom in time. For if I examine an act committed a second ago, must still recognize the unfreedom of the act, since the act is bound to the moment of time in which it was committed. Can I raise my arm? I raise it, but I ask myself, could I have not raised it in that already past moment of time? To convince myself of it, I do not raise my arm in the next moment. But it is not in the first moment when I asked myself about freedom that I did not raise my arm. Time went by, it was not in my power to stop it, and the arm which I then raised and the air in which I then made the movement are no longer the air which now surrounds me and the arm with which I now do not make that movement. The movement in which the first movement was performed is irretrievable, and at that moment I could make only one movement, and whatever movement I made, that movement could be the only one. The fact that I did not raise my arm the next moment does not prove that I could not have raised it. And since my movement could be the only one in one moment of time, it could not be any other. To imagine it as free, one must imagine it in the present, at the border of past and future, that is, outside of time, which is impossible. However, 3. However much the difficulty of comprehending causes may increase, we will never arrive at the notion of total freedom, that is, the absence of cause. However unfathomable it is for us in the cause of the expression of will in any act of mine or others, the first demand of intelligence is the assumption of and search for a cause, without which no phenomenon is conceivable. I raise my arm in order to perform an act independent of any cause, but the fact that I want to perform an act that has no cause is the cause of my act. But if, imagining a man completely excluded from all influences, examining only his instantaneous act in the present, not provoked by any cause, we should allow the infinitesimally small remainder of necessity to equal 0. We would still not arrive at a notion of man's total freedom, for a being who is not affected by the influence of the external world, who is outside time and does not depend on causes, is no longer a man. In the same way, we can never imagine the actions of a man without participation of freedom. In the same way, we can never imagine the actions of a man without any participation of freedom and subject only to the laws of necessity. 1. However much our knowledge of the spatial conditions in which man finds himself may increase, that knowledge can never be complete, since the number of those conditions is this is tricky. However much our knowledge of the spatial conditions in which man finds himself may increase, that knowledge can never be complete, since the number of those conditions are as infinitely great as space is infinite. And therefore, so long as not all the conditions influencing man are defined, there is no complete necessity, and there is a certain share of freedom. However much we may lengthen the period of time between the phenomenon we are examining and the time of judgment, that period will be finite. While time is infinite, and therefore, in that respect, there can never be complete necessity. 3. However accessible the chain of causes of an event, we will never know the entire chain because it is endless, and again we will never get complete necessity. But besides that, even if, having allowed this smallest remainder of freedom to equal 0, we were to recognize in some case, for instance, a dying man, a fetus, an idiot, a total absence of freedom, we would thereby destroy the very concept of the man we are examining, because once there is no freedom, there is no man, and therefore to imagine the action of a man that is subject only to the law of necessity without the slightest remainder of freedom, it is as impossible as to imagine a totally free action. Thus, to imagine the act of a man that is subject to the law of necessity alone without freedom, we must allow for the knowledge of an infinite number of spatial conditions, an infinitely great period of time, and an infinite series of causes. To imagine a man who is completely free, not subject to the law of necessity, we must imagine him alone, outside space, outside time, and outside any dependence on causes. In the first case, if necessity without freedom were possible, we would arrive at the definition of the law of necessity by that same necessity, that is, at form alone without content. In the second case, if freedom without necessity were possible, we would arrive at unconditional freedom outside space, time, and causes, which, by the very fact of being unconditional and unlimited by anything, would be nothing, or content alone without form. We would arrive generally at those two bases from which man's whole worldview is formed, at the unfathomable essence of life and at the laws which define the essence. Reason says, 1. Space with all the forms with its visibility, matter, gives it is infinite and cannot be conceived otherwise. 2. Time is infinite movement without a moment's rest and cannot be conceived otherwise. And 3. The linking of causes and effects has no beginning and can have no end. Consciousness says, 1. I am alone, that I exist, and all that exists is only I. Consequently, I includes space. 2. I measure fleeting time by the unmoving moment of the present, in which alone I am conscious of myself as living. Consequently, I am outside time. And 3. I am outside cause, for I feel myself to be the cause of every manifestation of my life. Reason expresses the law of necessities. Consciousness expresses the essence of freedom. Freedom, not limited by anything, is the essence of life and the consciousness of man. Necessity without context is man's reason with its 3 forms. Freedom is that which is examined. Necessity is that which examines. Freedom is content, necessity is form. only by the separation of the two sources of cognition, which are related to each other as form and to content, we do get the distinct, mutually exclusive, and unfathomable concepts of freedom and necessity. Only by their union do we get a clear picture of the life of man. Outside of these two concepts, mutually defining in their union as form and content, no picture of life is possible. All that we know about the life of man is only a certain relation of freedom to necessity, that is, of consciousness to the laws of reason. All that we know about the external world of nature is only a certain relation of the forces of nature to necessity, or of the essence of life to the laws of reason. All that we know about the external world of nature is only a certain relation of the forces of nature to necessity, essence of life to the laws of reason. The forces of the life of nature lie outside us, and we are not conscious of them. We call these forces gravity, inertia, electricity, animal force, and so on, but we are conscious of the force of man's life, and we call it freedom. But just as the force of gravity, unfathomable in itself, but sensed by every man, is only comprehensible to us insofar as we know the law of necessity it is subject to, from the primitive knowledge that all bodies are heavy, to Newton's law, so too the force of freedom, unfathomable in itself, but of which each of us is conscious, is only comprehensible to us insofar as we know the laws of necessity which it is subject to, starting from the fact that every man dies and going on as far as the knowledge of the most complex economic or historical laws. Any knowledge is only the placing of the essence of life under the laws of reason. Man's freedom differs from any other force in that man is conscious of this force, but for reason it is no different from any other force. The forces of gravity, electricity, or chemical agents differ from each other only in that they are differently defined by reason. In the same way, for reason, the force of man's freedom differs from all other forces of nature only by the definition which that same reason gives it. Freedom without necessity, that is, without the laws of reason which define it, does not differ in any way from gravity or heat or vegetative force. For reason, it is only a momentary, undefinable sensation of life. And as the undefinable essence of the force that moves the heavenly bodies, the undefinable essence of the force of heat, electricity, or chemical agents, or the life force that makes up the content of astronomy, physics, chemistry, botany, zoology, and so on, so the essence of the force of freedom makes up the content of history. But just as the subject of any science is the manifestation of its unknown essence of life, while the essence itself can only be the subject of metaphysics, so the manifestation of the force of man's freedom in space, time, and dependence on causes is the subject of history. Freedom itself is the subject of metaphysics. In experimental science, what is known to us we call the laws of necessity. What is unknown to us we call the life force. The life force is only the expression of the unknown remainder of what we know about the essence of life. It is the same with history. What is known to us we call the laws of necessity. What is unknown, freedom. For history, freedom is only the expression of the unknown remainder of what we know about the laws of human life. Section 11. History examines the manifestations of man's freedom in connection with the external world in time and independence on causes. That is, defines that freedom by the laws of reason, and therefore history is only a science insofar as that freedom is defined by those laws. For history to recognize man's freedom as a force capable of influencing his historical events, that is, not subject to laws, it is the same as for astronomy to recognize a free force moving the heavenly bodies. That recognition destroys the possibility of the existence of laws, that is, of any knowledge whatever. If at least one freely moving body exists, then the laws of Kepler and Newton no longer exist, nor does any notion of the movement of heavenly bodies. If there exists one free act of man, then not a single historical law exists or any notion of historical events. For history, there exist the lines of movement of human wills, one end of which vanishes into the unknown, but at the other end of which the consciousness of man's freedom in the present moves in space, in time, in dependence on causes. The more this field of movement expands before our eyes, the more obvious are the laws of this movement. To grasp and determine those laws constitutes the task of history. From the point of view from which historical science now looks at its subject on the path it follows, seeking the cause of phenomena in the free will of man, it is impossible for it to express laws. For however much we limit men's freedom, as soon as we recognize it as a force not subject to laws, the existence of law is impossible. Only by limiting this freedom infinitely, that is, by looking upon it as an infinitely small quantity, will we be convinced of the total inaccessibility of causes, and then, instead of searching for causes, history will set itself the task of searching for laws. The search for these laws has long since begun, and the new methods of thinking which history should adopt for itself are being worked out simultaneously with the self-destruction towards which, ever subdividing and subdividing the causes of phenomena, the old history is moving. All of mankind's sciences have followed this path. Having arrived at the infinitely small, mathematics, the most exact of sciences, abandons the process of subdividing and starts on a new process of summing up the unknown infinitesimals. Renouncing the concept of cause, mathematics seeks laws, that is, properties common to all unknown infinitely small elements. Other sciences, though in a different form, have followed this same path of thinking. When Newton formulated the laws of gravity, he did not say that the sun or the earth has the property of attraction. He said that all bodies, from the largest to the smallest, have this property of attracting each other, as it were. That is, leaving aside the question of the cause of the movement of the bodies, he formulated the property common to all bodies, from the infinitely large to the infinitely small. The natural sciences do the same. Leaving aside the question of cause, they seek for laws. History stands on the same path, and if history has for its subject of study the movement of peoples and of mankind, and not the description of episodes from people's lives, it should set aside the notion of causes and seek for the laws common to all, the equal and inseparably bound together, infinitely small elements of freedom. Section 12. Ever since Copernicus' law was found and proved, the mere recognition of the fact that what moves is not the sun but the earth has destroyed the whole cosmology of the ancients. It might have been possible, by refuting the law, to retain the old view of the movement of bodies, but without refuting it, it would have been impossible, it seems, to go on studying the Ptolemaic worlds. Yet, even after the discovery of Copernicus's law, the Ptolemaic worlds long went on being studied. Ever since the first man said and proved that the number of births or crimes obeys mathematical laws, that certain geographic and political economic conditions determine one or another form of government, and that certain relations of inhabitants to the land produce movements of people, ever since then the foundations on which history has been built were essentially destroyed. It might have been possible, by refuting the new laws, to retain the former view of history, but without refuting them it would have been impossible, it seems, to go on studying historical events as if they were proceeded from man's free will. For, if a certain form of government had been established, or a certain movement of peoples has taken place owing to such and such geographic, ethnographic, or economic conditions, then the will of those men who appear to us as establishing a form of government or provoking a movement of peoples can no longer be considered the cause. And yet the former history goes on being studied on par with the laws of statistics, geography, political economy, comparative philology, and geology, which directly contradict its postulates. A long and stubborn struggle went on in physical philosophy between the old and new views. Theology stood guard over the old view and accused the new of destroying revelation. But when the truth triumphed, theology established itself as firmly on the new soil. Just as long and stubborn a struggle has gone on in our time between the old and new views of history, and in the same way theology stands guard over the old views, and accuse the new of destroying revelation. In the one case, as in the other, the struggle on both sides arouses passions and stifles the truth. On one side of the struggle there is fear and pity for the whole edifice erected over the centuries, and on the other there is the passion for destruction. To the people who fought against the emerging truth of physical philosophy, it seemed that if they were to recognize that truth, faith in God, in the creation of the firmament, in the miracle of Joshua, son of Nun, would be destroyed. To the defenders of the law of Copernicus and Newton, Voltaire, for instance, it seemed that the laws of astronomy destroyed religion, and he used the law of gravity as a weapon against religion. In the same way, now it seems that we need only recognize the law of necessity and the notions of soul, of good and evil, and all state and church institutions based on those notions will be destroyed. In the same way now, as with Voltaire in his time, the uninvited defenders of the law of necessity use that as a weapon against religion, whereas, exactly like Copernicus's law in astronomy, the laws of necessity in history not only does not destroy, but even consolidates the ground on which state and church institutions are built. As in the question of history, then, so now in the question as in the question of astronomy, then, so now in the question of history, all the differences in view is based on the recognition or non-recognition of an absolute unit serving as a measure of visible phenomena. In astronomy, this was the immobility of the earth. In history, it is in the independence of the person, freedom. As for astronomy, the difficulty of recognizing the movement of the earth consisted in renouncing the immediate feeling of the immobility of the earth and the similar feelings of the movement of planets. So, for history, the difficulty of recognizing the subjugation of the peoples to the laws of space, time, and causes consists in renouncing the immediate feeling of the independence of one's person. But, as in astronomy, the new view said, true, we do not feel the movement of the earth, but by assuming its immobility, we arrive at an absurdity, whereas by assuming the movement which we do not feel, we arrive at laws. So too in history the new view says, true, we do not feel our dependence, but by assuming we are free, we arrive at an absurdity. Whereas, by assuming our dependence on the external world, time, and causes, we arrive at laws. In the first case, the need was to renounce the consciousness of a non-existent immobility in space and recognize a movement we do not feel. In the present case, it is just as necessary to renounce a non-existent freedom and recognize a dependence we do not feel. The end. The end. And the note in the appendix. Appendix, a few words apropos of the Book of War and Peace. Publishing a work on which I have spent 5 years of ceaseless and exclusive labor under the best conditions of life, I would like, in a preface to that work, to state my view of it and thereby forestall those perplexities which may arise in readers. Thank you. I would like readers not to see or seek in my book what I did not or was not able to express, and to pay attention to precisely what I wanted to express, but on which, given the conditions of its production, I did not consider it appropriate to dwell. Neither time nor my skill allowed me to fully carry out my intention, and I avail myself of the hospitality of a specialized journal to state, however briefly and incompletely for those readers whom it might interest, the author's view of his work. 1. What is War and Peace? It is not a novel, still less an epic poem, still less a historical chronicle. War and Peace is what the author wanted and was able to express in the form in which it is expressed. Such a declaration of the author's disregard of the conventional forms of artistic prose works might seem presumptuous if it were premeditated and if it had no previous examples. The history of Russian literature since Pushkin's time not only provides many examples of such departures from European forms, but does not offer even one example to the contrary. From Gogol's Dead Souls to Dostoevsky's Dead House, there is not a single work of artistic prose in the modern period of Russian literature, rising slightly above mediocrity, that would fit perfectly in the form of the novel, the epic, or the story. 2. The character of the time, as some readers expressed to me when the first part appeared in print, is insufficiently detailed or insufficiently defined in my work. To this reproach, I have the following rejoinder. I know what this character of the time is that people do not find in my novel. The horrors of serfdom, the immuring of wives, the whipping of adult sons, salted chica, and so on. This character of that time, which lives in our imagination, I do not consider correct and did not wish to express. Studying letters, diaries, and legends, I did not find all the horrors of that brutality in a greater degree than I find them now or at any other time. In those times, too, people loved, envied, sought truth, virtue, were carried away by passions. But there was the same complex mental and moral life, sometimes even more refined than now, among the upper classes. If in our mind we have formed an opinion of the arbitrariness and crude force characteristic of that time, it is only because the legends, memoirs, stories, and novels that have come down to us record only the most outstanding cases of violence and brutality. To conclude that the prevailing character of the time was brutality isn't as incorrect as it would be for a man who sees only treetops beyond a hill to conclude that there are nothing but trees in that region. There is a character of that time, as there is of every epoch, which comes from the greater alienation of the upper circles from the other estates, from the reigning philosophy, from peculiarities of upbringing, from the habit of using the French language, and so on. And this character I have tried as far as I could to express. 3. The use of French in a Russian work. Why is it that in my work not only the Russians but also the French speak partly in Russian, partly in French? The reproach that people speak and write in French in a Russian book is similar to the reproach made by a man who, looking at a painting, notices black spots in it, shadows, that are not found in reality. The painter is not to blame if the shadows he has made on the face in the painting looks to some like black spots that does not exist in reality, but is to blame only if those shadows are laid on incorrectly and crudely. Studying the period of the beginning of the present century, portraying Russian figures of a certain society and Napoleon and the French, who took such a direct part in the life of that time, I was involuntarily carried away more than necessary by the form of expression of that French way of thinking, and therefore, without denying that the shadows I laid on are probably incorrect and crude, I wish only that those to whom it seems very funny that Napoleon speaks now in Russian and now in French should know that it seems so to them because, like the man looking at the portrait, they see not a face with light and shadows, but only a black spot under his nose. 4. The names of characters, Bolkonsky, Dubretskoy, Bilibin, Kuragin, and others, resemble well-known Russian names. In juxtaposing non-historical characters with other characters who are historical, it felt awkward to my ear to make Count Rostopchin talk with Prince Pronsky, Strelsky, or some other princes or counts with invented double or single last names. Bolkonsky and Dubretskoy, though they are neither Volkonsky nor Trubetskoy, have the ring of something familiar and natural in a Russian aristocratic circle. I was unable to invent names for all my characters, such as Bazukov and Rostov, that did not seem false to my ear, and could not get around this difficulty otherwise than by taking the last names most familiar to a Russian ear and changing some letters in them. I would be very sorry if the similarity of the invented names to real persons could give anyone the idea that I meant to describe this or that real person, especially because the literary activity that consists in describing persons who really exist or existed has nothing in common with that which I was engaged in. M.D. Akrasimov and Denisov are exceptional characters to whom I involuntarily and thoughtlessly gave names that closely resemble those of two particularly distinctive and dear real persons of the society of that time. That was my mistake, which came from the particular distinctiveness of these two persons, but my mistake in this regard was limited to the introducing of these two characters alone, and readers will probably agree that nothing resembling reality happens to these characters. All the rest of the characters are completely invented and for me do not even have any specific prototypes in tradition or reality. Point 5. The divergence between my descriptions of historical events and the accounts of historians. It is not accidental, but inevitable. A historian and an artist describing a historical epoch have two completely different objects. As a historian would be wrong if he should try to present a historical figure in all his entirety, in all the complexity of his relations to all sides of life, so an artist would not fulfill his task by always representing a figure in his historical significance. Kutuzov did not always ride a white horse, holding a field glass and pointing at enemies. Rostopchin did not always take a torch in hand and set fire to his Voronovo house. In fact, he never did it at all. And the Empress Maria Fedorovna did not always stand in an ermine mantle, her hand resting on the code of law. But that is how we are pictured in popular imagination. How they are pictured in popular imagination. For a historian, considering the contributions rendered by some person towards a certain goal, there are heroes. For the artist, considering the correspondence of this person to all sides of life, there cannot and should not be any heroes, but there should be people. The historian is sometimes obliged by bending the truth to bring all the actions of a historical figure under one idea he has put into that figure. The artist, on the contrary, sees the very singularity of that idea as incompatible with his task and only tries to understand and show not the famous figure, but the human being. The distinction is still sharper and more substantial in the description of events themselves. The description is still sharper. A historian has to do with the result of an event, the artist with the fact of the event. A historian describing a battle says, "The left flank of such and such army was moving against such and such village, cut down the enemy, but was forced to retreat. Then the cavalry going into the attack overthrew," and so on. The historian cannot speak otherwise, and yet these words have no meaning for an artist and do not even touch upon the event itself. The artist, using his own experience or letters, memoirs, and accounts, derives for himself an image of the event that took place, and quite often, in a battle, for example, the conclusion which the historian allows himself to draw around the activity of such and such army turns out to be the opposite of the artist's conclusion. The difference between the results obtained is explained by the sources from which the two draw their information. For the historian, we continue the example of a battle. The main source is the reports of individual commanders and the commander-in-chief. The artist can draw nothing from such sources. They all tell him nothing, explain nothing. Moreover, the artist turns away from them, finding in them a necessary falsehood, to say nothing of the fact that with every battle, the two enemies almost always describe it in a totally opposite way from each other. In every description of a battle, there is a necessity for falsehood, which comes from the need to describe in a few words the actions of thousands of men scattered over several miles, for who are in the most intense moral agitation under the influence of fear, shame, and death. In descriptions of battles, it is usually written that such and such army was sent to attack such and such point, and then was then ordered to retreat, and so on. As if supposing that the discipline that makes tens of thousands of men obey the will of one man on the drill ground will have the same effect where it is a matter of life and death. Anyone who has been to war knows how incorrect that is. After the publication of my first part and the description of the Battle of Schöngraben, the words of Nikolai Nikolaevich Muravyov-Karsky were conveyed to me about this description of the battle, which confirmed my conviction. N.N. Muravyov, a commander-in-chief, said that he had never read a more faithful description of a battle, and that his own experience had convinced him that it is impossible to carry out the orders of a commander-in-chief during a battle. Anyone who has been in a war knows how incorrect that is. And yet official reports are based on this supposition, and the military descriptions on them. Make the rounds of a whole army right after a battle, even on the second or third day before the reports have been written, and ask all the soldiers, the senior and junior officers, how it went, and they will tell you what all these men experienced and saw, and you will form a majestic, complex, infinitely diverse, oppressive, and vague impression. And from no one, least of all the commander-in-chief, will you learn how it all went, But after 2 or 3 days, the reports begin to be submitted. Talkers will begin telling how what they did not see happened. Finally, a general account is put together, and the general opinion of the army is put together from this account. It is a relief to everyone to exchange his doubts and questions for this fact, but clear and always flat for this fault. To exchange his doubts and questions for this false but clear and always flattering picture. After a month or two, question a man about who took part in the battle. You will no longer feel in his story that raw material of life which had been there before. His account follows the report. So I was told about the Battle of Borodino by many living, intelligent participants in the affair. They all told me the same thing, and all following the incorrect description of Mikhailovsky, Danilevsky, Glinka, and others. Even the details they recounted were the same, though the narrators had been several miles from each other. After the loss of Sevastopol, the artillery commander Kryzhanovsky sent me the reports of the artillery officers from all the bastions and asked me to put those more than 20 accounts together into one. I am sorry I did not make copies of those reports. It was the best example of that naive and necessary military falsehood from which descriptions are put together. I suppose that many of my comrades who put together those accounts will then laugh, having read these lines, at the recollection of how, on orders from their superiors, they wrote something that they could not have known. Everyone who has had the experience of war knows how capable Russians are of doing their duty in war, and how little capable they are of describing it with the boastful falsity necessary to the task. Everyone knows that, in our armies, this duty of writing reports and accounts is for the most part carried out by our non-Russians. I say all this in order to show the inevitability of falsehood in the military descriptions which serve as material for military historians, and therefore to show the inevitability of frequent disagreements between artists and historians in understanding historical events. But besides the inevitability of untruths in their setting forth of historical events, I encountered in historians of that epoch that interested me, probably as a result of the habit of grouping of events, expressing them briefly, and conforming to that tragic tone of the events, a particular inclination to high-flown speech, in which falsehood and distortion often touch not only the events, but also the understanding of the meaning of an event. Often, in studying the two main historical productions of that epoch, Thiers and Mikhailovsky-Danilevsky, I would become perplexed at how these books could be printed and read. Not to speak of the setting forth of the same events in the most serious, significant tone with references to the materials, and yet diametrically opposed to each other, I encountered in these historians such descriptions that I did not know whether to laugh or weep when I remembered that these two books are the sole memorials of that epoch and have millions of readers. I will give only one example from the book of the famous historian Thiers. Having told how Napoleon brought counterfeit money with him, he says, augmenting the use of these means by an act of charity worthy of himself and of the French army, he had aid distributed to the victims of the fire. But food supplies being too precious to be given for long to foreigners, most of them enemies, Napoleon preferred to furnish them with money, and he had paper rubles distributed to them. This passage, taken separately, strikes one by its deafening, one cannot say immorality, but sheer meaninglessness. But within the book as a whole, it does not strike one because it corresponds perfectly to the high-flown, solemn tone, lacking in any direct meaning, of its overall style. And so the tasks of the artist and the historian are completely different, and the disagreements of the historian in the description of events and figures in my book should not strike the reader. But the artist should not forget that the notion of historical figures and events formed among people is based not on fantasy, but on historical documents, insofar as historians have been able to amass them, and therefore, while understanding and presenting these figures and events differently, the artist ought to be guided, like the historian, by historical materials. Wherever in my novel historical figures speak and act, I have not invented, but have made use of the materials of which, during my work, I have formed a whole library, the titles of which I find it unnecessary to set down here, but for which I can always give the reference. 6. Finally, the sixth, and for me the most important consideration, concerns the small significance which, to my mind, so-called great men have in historical events. In studying an epoch so tragic, so rich in the enormity of its events, and so near to us, of which such a variety of traditions still live, I arrived at the obviousness of the fact that the causes of the historical events that take place are inaccessible to our intelligence. To say, which seems quite simple to everyone, that the causes of an event of the year 12 are the conquering spirit of Napoleon and the patriotic firmness of the Emperor Alexander Pavlovich, is as meaningless as to say that the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire are that such and such barbarian led his people to the west, and such Roman emperor ruled his people badly, or that an immense mountain that was being leveled came down because the last workman drove his spade into it. Such an event, in which millions of men set about killing each other and killed 500,000, cannot have the will of one man as its cause, just as one man alone could not undermine a mountain, so one man cannot make 500,000 die. But what then are the causes? Some historians say that the cause was the conquering spirit of the French, the patriotism of Russia. Others speak of the democratic element that Napoleon's host spread about, and of the necessity for Russia to enter into the relations with Europe, and so on. But how is it that millions of men set about killing each other? Who ordered them to do it? It seems clear to everyone that no one could be the better for it, but all would be the worst. Why then do they do it? A countless number of retrospective conjectures have been made, and are being made, about the causes of this senseless event, but the enormous number of these explanations and their convergence on one goal only proves that there is a countless multitude of these causes, and that none of them can be called the cause. Why did millions of men set about killing each other, if it had been known ever since the world began, that it is both physically and morally bad? Because it was so inevitably necessary that, in fulfilling it, men were fulfilling that elementary zoological law which the bees fulfill by exterminating each other in the fall, and according to which male animals exterminate each other. No other answer can be given to this terrible question. The truth is not only obvious, but is so innate in every man that it would not be worth proving if there were not other feelings and consciousness in man, which convinces him that he is free at every moment as he performs some action. Examining history from a general point of view, we are unquestionably convinced of the pre-eternal law according to which the events take place. Looking from a personal point of view, we are convinced of the opposite. A man killing another, Napoleon giving the order to cross the Niemen, you and I applying for a job, raising and lowering our arm, are all unquestionably convinced that each of our acts is based on reasonable causes and our own will, and that it is dependent on us to act that way and not otherwise, and that conviction is so inherent and dear to each of us that, despite the arguments of history and the statistics of crime, which convince us of the involuntariness of other people's actions, we extend the consciousness of our freedom to all our acts. The contradiction seems insoluble. In committing an act, I am convinced that I am committing it according to my own good pleasure. Examining this act in terms of its being part of the common life of mankind, in its historical significance, I am convinced that this act was premeditated and inevitable. Where does the mistake lie? Psychological observations of man's ability to make an instantaneous retrospective adjustment of a whole series of allegedly free conjectures to an accomplished fact, I intend to set this forth in more detail elsewhere, confirm this assumption that man's consciousness of freedom in the committing of acts of a certain sort is mistaken. But those same psychological observations prove that there are acts of another sort in which the consciousness of freedom is not retrospective, but instantaneous and unquestionable. Whatever the materialists may say, I can unquestionably commit an act or refrain from it, insofar as that action concerns me alone. But by my will alone, I have unquestionably just raised and lowered my arm. I can presently stop writing. You can presently stop reading. Unquestionably, my will alone and outside any obstacles, I can mentally transport myself now to America or to any mathematical problem. Testing my freedom, I can raise and forcefully lower my arm in the air. I have just done so. But there is a child standing beside me. I raise my arm over him and want to lower it with the same force upon the child. I cannot do that. A dog attacks the child. I cannot help raising my arm against the dog. I stand in the ranks and cannot help following the movements of the regiment. In battle, I cannot help attacking with my regiment and fleeing when everyone around me flees. When I am standing in a court as a defender of an accused man, I cannot help speaking or knowing what I am about to say. I cannot help blinking when a blow is aimed at my eye. And so there are two sorts of acts. One depends, the other does not depend on my will. And the mistake that produces a contradiction comes only from the fact that I wrongly transfer the consciousness of freedom, which legitimately accompanies any act connected with my I, and with the highest abstraction of my existence, to my acts committed jointly with other people, and depending on the coinciding of other wills with my own. To determine the boundaries of the domain of freedom and the dependence is very difficult, and the determining of those boundaries is the essence and sole task of psychology. But observing the conditions of the manifestation of our greatest freedom and greatest dependence, it is impossible not to see that the more abstract our activity is, and therefore the less connected with the activity of others, the more free it is, and on the contrary, the more our activity is connected with other people, the more unfree it is. The most strong, indissoluble, burdensome, and constant connection with other people is the so-called power over other people, which is the true meaning, which in its true meaning is only the greatest dependence on them. Mistakenly or not, having become fully convinced that in the course of my work it was natural that, in describing the historical events of 1805, 1807, and especially 1812, in which the law of predetermination stands out most prominently, I could not ascribe importance to the activity of those people who fancied they were governing events, but who introduced less free human activity into them than all the other participants in events. It is worth noting that almost all the writers who have written about the year 12 have seen something special and fateful in those events. The activity of those people was interesting to me only as an illustration of that law of predetermination which, in my conviction, governs history, and of that psychological law which makes a person who commits the most unfree act adjust in his imagination a whole series of retrospective conjectures aimed at proving his freedom to himself. Count Leo Tolstoy, The Russian Archive, March 1868. And we are done. That is the end. Yay! All that's left in the book now is all these historical notes about, comments he makes about events. So if you really, really want every little nitty-gritty historical detail, you have my will and blessing to go forth, get the book, and look over these historical notes. But as far as the content of the book, we have finished, my friends. And that is all there is to be said. Oh, there's a little summary at the end. So if you really wanted to know the book but really didn't want to read it, I guess you could just read these little, one-sentence summaries for each little part. How crazy. I love it. So the epilogue, they describe the epilogue, the first part of talking about the different historical events that take place. And then for part 2, the whole of part 2, sections 1 through 12 is one line. They say, reflections on history and historians, greatness and power, freedom and necessity, which is so true. I mean, that's all that was, very meaty and deeply philosophical. Oh, hey, Brian, thanks for joining. Yes, congratulations to me. Congratulations to us. We made it through to the end. That is a feather in my cap. I can now say I have read the entirety of War and Peace. And what's more, I read it live for the first time with you. Thank you guys for sticking around. That ended up being a much longer read than I expected. But as I did say, deeply philosophical. But the one thing I have to say about all his philosophy is I sometimes question his sort of motives behind it, but I also am sometimes surprised at how it still resonates today. He does touch on like truths of human nature and human freedom and human actions that, resonate today, where he talks about one man is not the cause of the death of 500,000. Like, just as one man doesn't cause, a whole mountain to collapse. It's all about all the choices of all the people before him and around him and supporting him. And I think that is something that we should all take to heart, um, especially during this season, but also in our life, about how our choices are um, supporting other choices, other actions. What mountains are we contributing to the erosion of? What wars are we contributing to the deaths in? How do our choices build up things or tear things down? And I mean, especially in this heated political season, where I am right now, I can't seem to get away from it. There's always like political talk and punditing around. But also just in America right now, because there's so much division and so much conflict and so much questioning. Each of our choices have an impact, and they either choose to build something up and build up some sort of a movement, or tear down something or erode some sort of a thing. And so I think that's an important thing to always remember. And it's not just your free will that's at stake. Oh, what movie did you watch? You saw a movie. Brian says he saw a movie recently that touched on it related to the Holocaust. Which movie was it? That sounds really interesting. There's been that's definitely like a point that's really, really resonates with the story of the Holocaust. Of course, like, Hitler was awful, but he wasn't the only one killing people. And if he was the only one who had wanted to kill millions of people, he could not have done it. He needed other people to also create gas chambers, to throw the switch, to throw the gas in, to herd people in. He as one man could not physically do it. He had to have other people come alongside him. And so I think that's important to remember in all times, like not just now, but we have the free will to make choices, but those choices come to us as, like he said, via time and space and the causes around us, but also they contribute to other things going forward. And it's so, like I said, it's deeply, some of his stuff is really deep and really meaty and hard to grasp, but there is sort of a beauty in how universal it is. Can't remember the name of it. It was just about a journalist and the trial of someone who worked with him. The question was what did he know what he was doing, or was he basically just an employee? Right. Well, wasn't that like a lot of the trials post World War II, and like a lot of the trials in Nuremberg, where a lot of the Nazi party it came down to how much did they really know, how much did they really choose, and how much were they just blindly following orders? And I mean, I think that's something we can all relate to, of like, how often are we really engaging our brain, and how often are we just blindly following orders, blindly following our habits and our the conditions around us? Met someone who, oh wow, who worked with Hitler. Film of the actual trial was in the film. Oh, that sounds really cool. I bet if I Googled it, I could figure it out. If it was more of like a documentary too. Sounds really interesting. I'll look into it. Thanks, Brian. Well, guys, I'm not going to keep you too much longer because, especially with my philosophizing, we just had like over an hour of it from Tolstoy, and he had more time to think about it. Because he worked on this book for like 5+ years, and him and his wife like hand wrote the whole thing out. Like, she helped him write it out all by hand. So really, the fact that this 1,200-page book, and he rewrote it something like 6 or 7 times, and they rewrote it every time by hand, is truly amazing. And this is like, the mid-late 1800s in Russia. Very amazing, very incredible. I'm truly thankful for this time that I got to read this amazing piece of work. If anyone has any other books, though, that they would like to tackle with me, let me know. And I'd love to add it to my list. Like I said, I'm going to go on a brief hiatus, but check the channel every now and then. I'll post an update about what's coming down the pike. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for staying engaged. And thanks for just staying with me through it all. It's been great to see the numbers of people watching up there and know that I'm not just speaking into silence. So stay safe out there, folks. Keep trying to do good. Keep trying to fight for justice and remembering and, that all our actions affect each other. So act with love out there and stay safe. Thank you so much. Have a great long weekend, and I will hopefully see you in a week or two. Bye.